putting this together. I know, having suffered at the other end, how hard it is to get things organized and kept in place. Let me start with the obvious, but I think it's important to emphasize, is that violence is as old as civilization, and possibly as old as society, at least most societies. Oppression is also as old as our history, and exploitation is certainly as old, at least as class society. And so when we talk about capitalism, we're not talking about the creation of these things, we're talking about the appropriation of these things and the reproduction. And that's an important point, I think. Capitalism, it incorporates these and other elements which it inherits into the service of its own ends. And these ends involve creation of new things as well as the destruction of old things. It creates new relations as it destroys old ones. It creates new cultures as it destroys old ones. And it incorporates those that it doesn't destroy in a way that transforms them. I'm going to come back to that, but that's an important point, I think, historically. We know that the existence of capitalism is dependent crucially on colonization, force, the creation of use of force, violence, pillage, slavery, displacement, and slaughter of native peoples. And that is part of its genetic structure in the sense that sustained and fed its origins, and continues to be done, by the way, across the world now. So it's not just historical. Also, we know that capitalism targets potential competitors, and where the state, your state, can help you target someone else's. Industry violence is one of the means. So capitalist wars, inter-capitalist wars are part of that expression. It transfers wealth, historically, into the center through trade, through theft, and through violent expropriation. Again, this is not something merely in the past, it happens continually, and we know this when we look at the history of capitalism on a global scale, or the existence of capitalism on a global scale. Yet, and this is an important point for me, it also creates enormous wealth for some, and in fact, a rising standard of living for many in the center at least. And this is something that if we don't understand, we don't understand the power and attraction of capitalism when we start talking about alternatives. It's not just for people at the top, it is also for the working class. The working class is in fact incomparably richer in material sense than it was 100 years, 200 years ago. And in successful countries, this is a pretty steady pattern. And so I want to just mention it because I want to talk about the success before I talk about the consequences of that. So here's some, this is a typical pattern that one sees when you see capitalist history in the center. You're looking at the index of industrial production from 1860 to 2010, and you can see that, and this is only because that's where the data is, you can't go back, there's no consistent data, but it's a strong pattern that goes back certainly to the 19th century. And you can see that capitalism produces a rising level of production. This is a production index, subject to lots of fluctuations and a typical part of its characteristic form of expansion. This is an index of real GDP per capita. Now, that's also important. These are in the US, but pretty much every advanced country, Germany, France, Italy, UK, small ellipse here, have the same patterns over long periods of time. And you notice that this is per person. So this is another characteristic signature of capitalist success, which is a rising wealth per capita. Now we all know it's unequally distributed, but in fact, a portion of that success comes to the working class in the center. This is the other side. When you look at something like the long patterns of growth, you see fluctuations. When you look at the fluctuations, you see something else, which is the recurrence of ups and downs. That's what I mean by the term turbulence. This is its characteristic heartbeat. But I point your attention to the part here, which is something called the Great Depression, which is actually 1840s, and this is where Marx and Engels essentially get created. As political activists, as radicals, they move from being graduate students, so to speak, or postdocs, if you want to think of it that way, to what they are today. In the streets of Paris, in the streets of Germany, in the forests of Germany with Engels and so on. And you notice wars tend to be good for winners, and after wars there's a downturn, because once the pumping of the war dies out, then you get this downturn. So you have a civil war, which is pumping, and then the big collapse afterwards. So this is 1831 to 1862. This is 1867 to 1902. Again, you see the fluctuations, ups and downs. You see the Great Depression. But this is another Great Depression, which is known in the literature as a Great Depression of 1873 to 1893. It was much worse in Europe than it is in the United States. But unfortunately, we have good data for the US going far back. We don't have good data for Europe. But this is a depression in which Freud writes to his family, saying that we're very concerned about this depression, the rise of anti-Semitism. Typically, it takes place in Europe in depressions, and it lasts 20 years. That's why it's called the Long Depression. And so you can see other ups and downs typical of the system. And then this is 1903 to 1939. And here you see the great boom caused by World War I. And then you see another event, which is the Great Depression of 1930s. And again, this is pretty much this literature, the names they were called. After 1930s, the word depression was associated with such terrible things that the word was changed to recession, so that it didn't sound so bad. And so now orthodoxy will call the present period, 2007, the Great Recession. But it is in fact a Great Depression, as it was the 1980s. So you start counting, we're talking, at least as far as the data takes us back, at least 5 major events in the center, and that's my main point, in the center countries where supposedly the great benefits of capitalism are most visibly expressed. So with this pattern, it's important to then look at the other side of these patterns. I'm going to stop this, I think I don't need. Yeah, oh, here's one other side, which is very important. Here's the real wage in the United States from 1889, and that's the blue line, and the dark line is productivity. And you see that real wages rise steadily with ups and downs throughout for a very long period of time, and productivity rises. You get the illusion that the two are tied together. But in fact, in the post-war period, and in the neoliberal era, you see quickly that they are tied together by social institutional factors, nothing intrinsic. And when there's a shift in that balance of power, when the power structure balance goes in favor of capital against labor, then the real wage growth essentially disappears, and productivity continues to rise. In a Marxist sense, this is a period of great rise in the rate of surplus value. And I spent some time in the book on that. My concern here is to emphasize that the glue that binds the system together is an evolving pattern of social and historical mixtures, yet some elements persist throughout. Productivity continues to rise throughout, and that's an important thing to understand because it operates at the micro level. Firms are forced to fight to reduce costs and to increase, to mechanize, to increase productivity, because that's a mechanism, that's their survival mechanism. That's how they manage to survive. So then the question arises, what about other countries? And I'm going to come to that. But first point, I think it's important to understand that what existed before is not necessarily preferable, nor would we necessarily want to be in it. Let me speak from my own historical and personal perspective. I was born in India before partition. India, as you know, is characterized by a brutal system of domination we call the caste system. And its historical treatment of people in the lower caste, which is pretty much everybody except for a few top castes, is well documented, and its treatment of women is well documented. And nobody is talking about going back to that. They may speak of the destruction created by capitalism on India, was after all a colony, and that's a real destruction. But it doesn't, one should not mythologize what existed prior to that, nor the Mughals, which is my side of the story, because I'm not Hindu, I was born Muslim, but we're a pretty rotten bunch in a pretty rotten social structure, and that's something to keep in mind. What drives this? What drives this peculiar dynamic of the destruction of some things and the creation of other things? For me, the answer is that we have to go down to the thing that doesn't change through all of this history, which is profit, as I emphasized in the session just previous to this. That profit motive operates at the individual level. It's a survival mechanism of capitalism that you have to grow to live, and in order to grow you have to cut costs to compete against your competitors. So it's an expansionary system at the micro level, like a cancer cell in many ways. It expands. It has to expand. And it expands across the globe, it expands across time. And that search for profits and the need to lower costs explains many of the key features. The lower cost means that it is an incentive capitalist to push down on labor all the time. Left to themselves, you get 16 or 18-hour working day, 6 or 7 days a week, with extremely low wages. And I'm not just talking about the time of Engels and Marx, I'm talking about China today. That's left to itself, that's what it can do. And it's only because forces rise to prevent that it does anything else. That's, in a sense, its natural state if it's left unattended. Environmental pollution. Again, we know historically the great degradation of the environment, but it comes in the micro level. Firms get a benefit if they can pass on the cost of their production to society. Why would they not do it? It's not good capitalists and bad capitalists, it's capitalists. It's the incentive structure of the system itself. So then you have to impose limits, and its job is to try to get around those limits, and then you impose more limits, or you buy off the senators, and they're generally cheaper than going around the limits. So you have to figure out ways to undo those limits, and that's a perpetual battle between the incentive structure of capitalism and the social reaction to that incentive structure, which is try to contain it. And it is a non-ending battle, and it often moves to different spaces and spheres as you block one. It's obviously cheaper if you're selling something to do it in the cheapest way, even if it's poisonous. So there's a tremendous incentive for sellers and capitalists in general to misrepresent. I bring this up because as an economist, one of the things that annoys me the most is the idea of capitalism as a purveyor of information. It's a purveyor of misinformation and disinformation far more than it's a purveyor of information. Its job is to make something that sells, and if a lie sells, well, let me run for president. There's no big deal. So that's not a problem to understand historically. Capitalism also opens new productive forces. That's the point of these pictures here. It creates and opens up forces. I just froze it, it doesn't matter. It creates, but it also displaces and it blocks. Every capitalist has an incentive to lower their costs, but it's also an incentive to block other capitalists. And when you get the state to help you, then it's perfectly possible to do that. And we know from the history of capitalism, in British capitalism, the destruction of the textile industry in India. Massive social consequences, misery, starvation, loss of place and life. At the same time, this capitalism also creates new industries in India to its own benefit of the center. We look in China today. It not just transforms China, it creates a manufacturing industry in China, which is the source of the little iPhones and other phones we carry around in our pocket, which are cheaper to produce there than they are anywhere in the center. So that's its dynamic. It is also largely indifferent to any social needs that are not profitable. The New York Times recently had an article about 100,000 people or hundreds of thousands of people die every year from malaria. Why? Because it's not profitable to make a vaccine. The vaccine itself wouldn't sell enough at any cost that they can make it for, so they don't want to bother. It's just not a big enough market, that's all. So if you're going to do it, the state has to step in, or something has to step in to do it itself, because it's not an incentive structure of firms. So you can think of this as a defense of capitalism. I want to make that's a central point, that it does what it needs to do, and to accuse it of not doing something is to misunderstand its logic. We can, of course, argue against and fight against what it does, but it's not because of an oversight. It's because it has a logic itself. So then, two questions arise. How much can capitalism accommodate? This is an important question, in my opinion, because it's the source of many struggles. Sue mentioned that I come from a historical, personal background of anti-war movements, feminist movements, civil rights. I actually met Malcolm X. I mean, I also met his successor, and I met and worked with Panthers, and I lived in Harlem, so these were not abstract things for me. And one of the debates that comes up typically in the feminist movement, in the civil rights movement, in the Black Power movement, in the Nation of Islam, was, are you talking about changing capitalism, or are you talking about infiltrating capitalism? Are you talking about having an equal distribution of men and women, equal distribution in proportion to population of black and white? And everybody who's been on the left knows that that debate is very central in political practice, because people who want to focus on their own group tend to be pretty conservative in many other senses, because they're talking about getting into the system rather than changing the system. But that's a real dynamic, because capitalism allows you that space, and it can accommodate that. I believe that capitalism can accommodate equalities of a remarkable number of sorts, but it has to create new ones at the same time, because it has to also have people who are excluded. So whether the old ones are the ones or new ones depends on the pressure. But I don't think there's any difficulty in it accommodating a particular group or particular demand, as long as it can displace its needs, so to speak, on another sector. It can create a new sector. Typically, the white working class has suffered a lot in all the advanced world. And this suffering means literally that it has lost its place, it's lost its income, and it's lost its future, its sense of itself. For many people, especially in jobs that have been eliminated, in neighborhoods where there is nothing anymore, these people are rightfully seeing themselves as displaced. And yet, from the same time, we can talk about the increased number of women in the workforce, the increased number of black people, and the better treatment, and all of that. And that's also a truth, and it's something we fought for. But the fact is that that same impact on the people who are displaced has given rise and supported a tremendous number of right-wing movements, fascist movements, really. And that's true not just in the United States, but also in Europe now. You can see the crisis has brought out the flower of fascism in response to the conditions that they confront. So what are we facing? Are we facing an environmental catastrophe, or can capitalism deal with the environment? Are we facing an employment catastrophe? Robotization is very recent. It's just beginning. The next time you see me, it won't be me, it'll be a robot, because it's cheaper. You don't have to pay. I can just stick in my SIM card into something, and then I can get direction. Capitalism is very good at that, and it's just beginning. But that does have an implication. How do you deal with the fact that it's not going to provide, it may not provide jobs for the people who are eliminated? And my answer is, look around and see what capitalism is doing. It's also reducing the population, and is doing so with people in a variety of ways. Disease is one, war is another. But mandatory population control, like China's one-child policy. But look around a room like this. If you looked around and counted the number of children that people in this room have, you would find a dramatically smaller number than if it was 50 years ago. And the reason is pretty simple. People now have fewer children voluntarily, and many people don't have any children. In many advanced countries, the segment of the population, which is the ones with the job and with the education and with the future, are self-extinguishing. That is to say, as a group, that segment produces fewer people than themselves by significant number. It's not uncommon to have one child for every couple, or one child for every potential couple, 50-50, and perhaps even less. Well, you can do the math. It doesn't take many generations for that group